I really hope. Okay. Hello, everyone. We'll be starting momentarily as we let people trickle in. Thank you so much for joining, and we will get started very quickly. Good to see everyone. Good morning. Hey, welcome everyone. I'm Devika Rao with on behalf of Louisiana the Developmental Disabilities Council. We're really excited to kick off this new third year of our series, Working Together, a webinar series that's really focused on employing and hiring people with developmental disabilities across the state. This year's series is called Your Next Best Hire. We're really excited about showcasing the skills and talents of individuals with developmental disabilities and how employers and hiring professionals can include them in their recruiting process and their diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in their workplace. I'm really excited. We're joined here with Rikki David, with the state ADA coordinator, who will be leading our very first session. No pressure, but we will really from the beginning. We will talk about really what is building DE&I in the workplace. What are things, if you're a hiring professional, if you're an employer, you're a business owner, what is it that you should know? And how can you start building this into your hiring practices? Because we all know that it's not easy to do that. And any little step we can take to make sure our workforces are more inclusive and they obviously create better results for businesses and everyone involved. So we're going to get started, and there are captions available, and we'll go through some housekeeping rules, and then I will hand it over to Rikki, not to waste one more minute. So just a little bit about this webinar series. It is presented by the Louisiana Developmental Disabilities Council. We are a governor appointed council that sits advocates on behalf of people with developmental disabilities across the state. I am Devika Rao, I'm the producer of this series this year. We're with an agency called 23 East Group. We are a disability marketing communications firm. We love working with this space and community. And so we're excited to bring a third year of this series for you all. The Next Best Hire webinar series is going on till August. There might be more sessions added. As you see, the list is pretty intensive, and what we really, again, are trying to make sure that all the topics that we're covering are really supporting our employers and our hiring professionals and even individuals, managerial, to really learn about what some benefits are to hiring people with developmental disabilities in their workforce, what resources are available to you from the state, and there are plenty that will make this such a rewarding experience. And then how do you also find individuals with developmental disabilities? What programs are available? How can different agencies across the state help recruit for you? And again, there are plenty of resources that employers should be tapping into that are available to them. We will also meet employers who have put disability in their DE&I practice and learn from them on what they did and kind of benefits that happened for them. So you'll see this calendar here. We'll be sending this out periodically for registrations. Registrations are open, and we will also be sending that over to you all at the end of this program. Some housekeeping tools. Please go ahead and raise your hand for an icon if you have questions. You can drop them in chat. You can drop them in the Q&A section, wherever you feel comfortable, but we're all here to help you. And we really want to make sure this is a rewarding experience and educational experience. Definitely use emojis. Who doesn't love emojis? Let us know you like something, you resonated with something, give us some feedback, but we really want you to engage, and no question is off limits. Again, we want to be able for you to walk away with enough information that you can use to practice and also keep coming back to build on in this webinar series. Today, I'm excited to welcome Rikki David, who is a state ADA coordinator of the Division of Administration. She will be leading this first webinar, kind of giving you the ins and outs of what building DE&I in the workplace is. She will be introducing herself, but in a minute. And today's learning objectives are very simple, not very simple, but what we're hoping to walk away with is really learning what DE&I is, what are the elements of a successful space like that, the reasons to include disabilities in DE&I, and how to build a disability inclusive workforce. These are all from Rikki's presentation. So I'm going to hand it over to her. I'm going to switch over to her presentation. And Rikki, welcome. And I'm excited to welcome you. And just a little introduction of yourself would be great.
I am so pleased to be here. As Devika mentioned, my name is Rikki David, and I am the state ADA coordinator for the state of Louisiana. This office was established approximately 2 years ago, and my job is to help people understand and comply with the ADA. I answer a lot of questions regarding, what kind of accommodations are required, what are the what does the law say on this situation or that situation? And these are questions from businesses, employers, individuals with disabilities. So I serve not just state government, but also the general public. So you'll see on this first slide, my phone number and email address are at the bottom. Feel free to jot those down. If you have questions afterwards, you're welcome to reach out to me and I'll help you in any way I can. So today's topic, building DEI in the workplace, I think is really relevant and timely for employers with the labor shortage that's going on and the changes that we've seen in the workplace over the last couple of years. So I really wanted to go through this and help. How do we build DEI into our workplaces? So next slide. So what is DEI? This stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we're talking about a diversity of people and perspectives, equity in the way that we administer our policies and our practices, and then also inclusion of all voices and visions. So it really is a holistic workplace brought together. Next slide. So I also included this other perspective. It's similar, but it goes into a little bit difference. We're talking about diversity, and we're going to have a presence of differences between people. We're going to see visually those differences in our workforce. We're not all one race, one color, one religion. We've got diversity of people. Then we're also going to have an equity in the way that we access and have opportunities and provide support. So it's fair access. We're going to have fair and equal opportunity. Sorry. Can we go? There we go. And then we're also going to have a genuine sense of belonging and value in that inclusion. And why I like this graphic even more than the first one is because you see people with disabilities in the graphic. So we see people who are wheelchair users. We have someone with a limb difference, someone who's using a white cane. So it's really important because not all DEI includes disability. So we'll talk about maybe why that is in a couple more slides, but that's why I really like this graphic even more, is because it does include disabilities. So that's an important point. Next slide. So DEI really varies across employers. Obviously, it's going to depend on your resources and the things that you have available at your I'm sorry, office. I lost the word for a second. But in general, there's going to be a couple of common elements that we see across DEI programs. One is data collection. So it's really important to collect information about your workforce to develop kind of a baseline so that you can gauge whether your DEI is really effective in increasing diversity. So you're going to want to collect that data from your workforce. The second is reviewing those organizational policies and practices. So we want to look at them from the perspective of addressing inequities within the organization. And then also being sure to implement recruiting practices that are going to promote hiring people across diversity groups. So that's really important as well. The third component is education. So DEI usually is going to involve some kind of training for employees. And it's really to encourage people to be more aware and reflect on the inequities and the discrimination on an individualized basis. Like, how does this apply to me in the workplace? You know, whether you're a supervisor, not a supervisor, how do I maybe have unconscious bias? Maybe how do I interact with people with disabilities? And so that's really important so that people don't just see it as an organizational program, but it's something that they can apply to themselves. And then the last thing is going to be dedicated staff. Generally, to be effective, you have to dedicate resources. So we're going to see generally between 1 and 3 dedicated DEI staff members if an organization wants to have a DEI program. Next slide. So DEI started, it's been a slow progression over the last 60 years, starting really with, I'm sorry, I have automatic lights. If y'all have those in your office, it drives me crazy. But the anti-discrimination laws started back in the 60s and 70s, really started with Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. And this prohibits discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. Then we also have the Age Discrimination in Employment Act that was passed that protects people who are age 40 or older from discrimination due to age. And while this was a good start, it's really reactive. You know, these laws are obviously reactive to discrimination that was taking place, and basically focuses on what not to do. So over time, we've shifted, and then it came into the 80s and 90s, and we saw some more changes. First, we passed the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, which prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities. And so then you also saw a transition as far as moving from that reactive to a more proactive, but it was affirmative action, really where we were requiring employers to set goals on how to increase diversity, specifically for females and for minorities. And while this was a good start and it's more proactive than just the law, it's still compliance-based. It's you set a goal and you're counting numbers to get to something. So it's still seen as a compliance-based process. So then we progress over the last couple of years. Really in 2020, we saw a big shift to this concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it was responsive to the George Floyd's murder. And we saw increases of dedicated DEI professionals being hired by up to 55% more. And the importance here was that we shifted away from that compliance-based to more of a true holistic change where we're looking at how do we address historically marginalized groups in our organizations. So I think that that's a really important shift, but you can see it's taken a long time for us to get to this point. Next slide. So unfortunately, disability is oftentimes left out of DEI, like I mentioned earlier. And I think there's 2 reasons for that. One being that disability has a separate civil rights law, that ADA, that was passed decades after Title VII. So disability isn't really seen as a protected class the same way that other groups are. Even though it really is, because it has a separate law, it's not with Title VII and all of those other protected groups in the same law. People just don't see it the same way, unfortunately. The other thing is that those affirmative action and the DEI efforts have been primarily focused on race and sex-based diversity. So, that previous slide we were talking about, the focus of those efforts were race and sex, increasing affirmative action goals or addressing inequities, but either in race or sex or both. And so diversity got left out of the equation. And so that's why it's going to be really important for us to talk about the next slide. We can talk about reasons to include disability in DEI. So there's some really good reasons for employers to include disability as a category in your DEI program. And the first is that the disability community is the largest and most diverse minority group out there. So approximately 54 million, or 20% of Americans, have at least one disability. So it's the largest minority group. It's also a really heterogeneous group because it crosses race, sex, ethnicity, all those other categories. So you're talking about a true example of what diversity inclusion looks like, because it is so widely diverse. There's no two disability, members that look exactly the same. They're all going to have difference, and that's what makes this great, So that's really important to think about and consider of why to include disability in your DEI program. Another point is it really represents an untapped labor pool, because people with disabilities are 2 times more likely than those without a disability to be unemployed. So you have a group of people that want to work that are not employed. And so with the current labor shortage, we had the Great Resignation a couple years ago. We were all struggling to find talent. This is a great market to tap for talent. And so I think that this is really one of the most important reasons why we should include disability in our DEI programs, because we're missing out on this great pool of talent that we just haven't been hitting. And then the last point is that disabled employees are dedicated and motivated. So because people with disabilities often struggle to find a job, when they find a position that really matches their skills and abilities, they show up. They have less absenteeism, they have less tardiness, and their turnover is far less. So it's really important, if you want a good quality workforce, someone who's going to stay, and turnover is the bane of every employer's existence. This is how you're going to address employee turnover. So these are 3 great reasons why to include disability in your DEI program. Next slide. Unfortunately, DEI has left the building in large part over the last couple of years. So whereas in 2020, we saw increases up to 55% more DEI roles, now DEI roles have an attrition rate of 33% by the end of 2022. And this is almost 1.5 times the attrition rate of non-DEI roles. So this is very significant. And I think there's a couple of reasons for this. Next slide. One is that DEI has become somewhat politicized in the news media. And so there have been attacks on DEI initiatives, calling them illegal, and they're indoctrinating, and they've gone woke. And this is all important to understand, not because you're a right-wing or a left-wing political person, but because we need to know that that's how DEI is perceived so that we can overcome that in our organizations, so that we can prove ourselves important, that this has value to our organization. Because I think that that's one of the things that has led to DEI being reduced by 33%, is because it's now seen as a political issue and we don't want to be associated with that. So we're just going to not have that anymore. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind. Next slide. The other thing is there's been DEI layoffs. Companies have been cutting costs at the expense of diversity, and large employers that we're all well aware of, Amazon, Applebee's, and Twitter, are some of the biggest that have had layoffs in the last year. But part of why DEI has become expendable is because the efforts were really disingenuous. It kind of fell back to checking the box. They were doing it because it sounded good. Everybody else was doing it, but these companies obviously didn't have the desire to affect true change. They also had lack of buy-in from executive management, which is really important to launching any program or any service in an organization. You have to have your executive management buy-in. And then the last is the DEI professionals didn't tie their gains in diversity to the organization's mission and profitability. So you have to tie it to the bottom line. You have to prove that there's a value to the organization. And especially for DEI, when you're talking about DEI, human resources, accounting, a lot of the service groups within an organization are not viewed as profit groups. And so they're seen as a drain on the budget. And so you have to prove that there's a value added back to the organization. Otherwise, they're going to get cut. They're going to be reduced. And so I think all of that has factored into the overall attrition rate that we've seen with DEI professionals. Next slide. But let's talk about, how do we build then? How do we build a disability inclusive workforce knowing these challenges? How do we overcome those? And I think the first step is to make sure that we implement a procedure where our employees can confidentially and voluntarily self-identify as having a disability. So it goes back to that data collection component of your DEI plan. You need to have a way to collect data. And so if you are a federal contractor, you're required to do this because of the Rehab Act. Or if you're a Louisiana executive branch state agency, there is a Louisiana law that requires the voluntary self-ID process. And so in either of those cases, you may be required by law to do it. But even if not, it's important as a good first step, and you've got to know your baseline. You've got to collect that data, because then that's going to filter into our next strategy, which is making the business case. Next slide. So we have to make the true business case, not the social, not the compliance, not the political. We have to overcome those. We have to be able to make the true business case with dollars and cents to our executive management. We have to prove that diversity matters. It hits the budget. We have to translate it in a way that our executive management is going to understand. So, I gave a simple formula here, and you could develop whatever formula you want, but something that's going to provide a real example of how this affects your organization's bottom line. So do we have an increased percentage of employees with disabilities by 10%? Well, in that same time frame, our turnover was reduced by 5%, which then reduced our recruiting and training costs by $65,000. That $65,000 savings matters to your executive management. If they know that if they can translate that money back to DEI and they tie those two together, you're going to be more likely to keep your DEI program. So also for profitability, you can consider, if you're a federal contractor or want to be a subcontractor, you have to have affirmative action employment opportunities for people with disabilities. And so this is another way to really tie the money back and say, hey, we have these contracts, or we want to bid on these contracts. We have to do this process, and we need to have DEI in place. And so again, it's going to tie those revenues and that funding back to DEI. And now we have a business case for why we're doing it, not just because it sounds good, not because it's socially acceptable, but because it makes dollars and cents to our management. Next slide. The third step, I would say, would be to develop a network of disability inclusive partners that you can team up with. And that's going to be both internally and externally. So internally, you want to find people who have a personal connection to disability within your organization. So again, because 1 in 4 people have a disability, you have people on staff already that have disabilities that you may not know about. And if they don't, they have someone in their family that likely does. So it's really important to find people that have that personal connection, because then they can help push the movement forward and push for the disability friendly policies and practices. So when they have that connection and they feel empowered to participate in that process, I think you're going to be more effective. And then also finding those external partners. So a lot of times those are going to be your state and local agencies that support people with disabilities. So we're talking Louisiana Rehabilitation Services. And also each of the colleges and universities have an Office of Disability Services that supports students with disabilities. And so that's a great resource to reach out to as well, that may be able to find job applicants, students that are with disabilities that are about to graduate in your field of area. Here we go again, sorry about that. In whatever your organization does. And so that's a great conduit to find some new talent for your organization. And then you also have local partners. 2 of these examples are Families Helping Families and the ARC. These are nonprofit groups that are statewide in Louisiana, but each has like a local chapter that may be close to you. And these are really wonderful organizations that provide a lot of support for people with disabilities. And so they could also be a great partner with your organization as well. Next slide. So, and then fourth, we have to train. We have to provide training and education. And so this needs to be regular and recurring, and talk about disability awareness and etiquette and accommodations. You know, the ADA requires us to provide accommodations for people with disabilities. And so we need to talk about all of these issues and try to dispel the myths about the disability community and help employees to respectfully communicate and interact with their coworkers that have disabilities. You know, a lot of that's going to touch on, you know, the concept of ableism, you know, trying to address language and maybe unintentional biases, things that we don't necessarily think about, but we can help address so that we do have a truly equitable workforce that is inclusive of our employees with disabilities. And then also be sure to include your ADA policy and accommodation request form if you have one, readily available on your website. Make it really easy for employees to request accommodations that if they need them. So make sure that information is readily available to your employees. Next slide. So for more information to help with developing your DEI program, I highly recommend this guide. It's called Disability Employment and Inclusion. And this is offered by Ask Jan, which is a job accommodation network. And it's a great resource. It's going to walk you through how to build your business case, like we've talked about, how to plan out your process, develop those community partners, and lots more. So I would highly recommend you take a look at that if you're launching your DEI program, or you just want to get help in doing more in this vein. It's a really great resource. Next slide. And these are just a couple of the sources from the data that was presented in the presentation. Next slide. And questions. As I mentioned before, you're welcome to write down my name and phone number and email address if you have questions. But certainly now, if you have any that you want to address, you can raise your hand or unmute yourself. I guess you can put them in the chat too as well, huh, Devika?
Yes, if you have any questions or comments or any kind of things you want to run across Rikki, this is a great time to, you can raise your hand or put them in chat, just like she said. Thank you so much for this great presentation. I think it was very comprehensive. I definitely learned a lot. I do personally have some questions that I'd love to ask you about in regards to what you covered today.
Sure.
I am going to stop sharing my screen so we can see you. I think one of our big questions we have for today, I have for today from listening to you is, we're talking about businesses and building these resources. And majority of the workforce is actually small businesses. So is there a way, like when you're talking about building DE&I, how do small businesses or when someone or a business owner who has a small staff try to incorporate principles without having to feel kind of overwhelmed by building a huge program, which eventually you want to get to or think about it? How can we start a smaller step-by-step process? What are some things we could consider for small business owners?
Yeah, for small businesses, I would say, they're probably used to wearing a lot of hats. If you work at a small company, you may be the janitor, you may be the accounting person, you may be like 5 or 6 different things all at once. And so I think it would be to carve out some responsibility for DEI. You have to have someone, even if it's not their full-time job, but someone who's going to be designated to help really push that initiative forward, but also just mindfulness in how you're operating. So is your building accessible? If you're a small business that is, has a public front to it, is your building accessible that people with disabilities can access your building? Do you have a website that is available, that is accessible? And that's not something that we mentioned in here, but certainly DEI should include digital accessibility, because nowadays that's so much of what we do. And a lot of small businesses, that may be their storefront, is just their website. So if you just make sure that your website is accessible, you've already made great strides in DEI. And so I think it's things like that. We're just taking it maybe on a smaller scale, but there's still things that can be done to move this forward, even for small businesses.
Absolutely. I think that's a great question. I know in the rest of the series, we're going to kind of elaborate a lot on what you have touched about, making it a little bit more focused on how do we find recruits? What kind of resources can we do? And I believe you touched on this a little bit earlier, but just again, how does your office support DE&I efforts or ADA efforts for the state, obviously, and how can, say, some of our individuals who want to reach out to you for any questions, what kind of support could they receive from the ADA office?
Absolutely. So the intent of my office is to provide educational and technical support. So to anyone that has questions about the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I failed to mention earlier, prior to having this role, I served 20 years as a human resources director. So I have experience hiring staffs and running an HR office. And so I understand the challenges that employers face in finding talent. And so I think it's just really important to understand that all of this ties together. But with the HR perspective, it gives me an opportunity to even answer questions sometimes about related things like family medical leave. Family medical leave and the ADA kind of go hand in hand. I call them kind of sister laws. And so, so sometimes I will also answer questions about that. But certainly the educational support that I provide is in trainings like this. It's, you know, face-to-face presentations for groups of people. But I also do a lot of technical support, just one-on-one. Hey, this is the issue that we're having. You know, my building, you know, they may have a question as far as what do I have to do? How many accessible parking places do I have to have in my parking lot? You know, how do I handle this employee that, you know, has now developed a disability and needs these things to be able to do their job? You know, how do we process that? And so it can be very generalized. It can be in the form of a presentation, or it can be very specific situations where you're like, hey, I don't know what to do with this. And then I can guide you through what are the requirements, how would I recommend that you handle this? So I can really provide either or both kinds of support.
Absolutely. Very, very important to know how we can utilize resources that are available to all of us. I'm going to open it up to our attendees. Any questions for Rikki and how on what she has covered, or anything that's popped up in your mind that you would like her to talk about? I know we have a small house today, but I hope it's very and like I said earlier, it's an intentional space we want to build, that we really want to make sure that employees and hiring professionals are kind of getting the resources they need. But we welcome anyone's questions. We welcome anyone's
lights, man.
And if you don't have questions right away, you can definitely email us and we will be able to respond to you personally. And then, but this webinar will be available on recording. So in case there's, I know the 4 or 5 step process you talked about, building the DEI workforce, that was definitely important. And we will be sharing that with our attendees and registrations, so that way they can attend and learn from you after the fact.
Sounds great.
Well, since there are no questions, I'm going to give back some time to everybody, which I think everybody enjoys nowadays. So thank you so much for being here today. And we will definitely send a note out to everybody for a survey, but also registration for the next series that will be actually covering employers who have put this into practice and kind of what was beneficial to them, and resources that are available to businesses across the state. So thank you so much, Rikki, for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank everyone who was able to join, and we will be in touch for the next round of our webinars.
Bye.
Thank you so much, everyone.